The letter arrived on a Tuesday, and by Thursday, Martha Holloway had already told half the county. "She's selling herself," Martha announced at the feed store, loud enough for 3 people to hear. Like cattle at auction, a woman her age answering some stranger's advertisement. She set her basket down with a sharp clack on the wooden counter. Pathetic. Absolutely pathetic. Evelyn Mercer was standing 6 feet away. She didn't turn around. She picked up her flour, counted out her coins, and walked out that door without a single word. Because she had learned, in 27 years of living in a town that had taken everything from her family, that silence was sometimes the only weapon left. But her hands were shaking. If you had been standing in her shoes that morning, broke, invisible, 30 seconds away from the only escape you'd ever dared imagine being mocked in public, what would you have done? If this kind of story moves you, please subscribe and follow along to the end. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. And stay close, because what's coming will take your breath away. Evelyn Mercer had been invisible for so long that she had almost stopped noticing. That is the kind of thing that happens slowly. It doesn't announce itself. One morning you wake up and realize that when people look at you, they are not really looking at you. They are looking at your father's debt, your worn coat, the dark circles beneath your eyes that come from working a bookkeeping job 6 days a week for a hardware store owned by a man who paid her 70 cents less per hour than he paid the boy she had trained herself. You stop correcting people when they forget your name. You stop raising your hand when you have the right answer. You stop, gradually, taking up space. Evelyn had done all of that. She had become a woman who moved through Shelby, Ohio like furniture, present, necessary in a quiet way, and completely overlooked. Her father, Raymond Mercer, had been a good man who made one terrible decision. A business loan in 1951, co-signed with a partner who disappeared before the ink was dry, left Raymond owing $11,000 to a bank that had no interest in sympathy. Raymond died in the winter of 1953, when Evelyn was 17, and left her 2 things: a Bible with her mother's name written inside the front cover, and that debt, now transferred, now hers. She didn't fight it. Fighting would have cost money she didn't have and time she couldn't spare. Instead, she worked. Bookkeeping for Daryl's Hardware, mending clothes on the side for Mrs. Patterson, who always paid late and always found something to criticize. Saturday mornings at the diner, where the tips were never more than a quarter, and the cook called her honey in a way that made her skin crawl. She ate small. She kept the heat low. She wore the same 3 dresses on rotation for 4 years, and she didn't complain because complaining required energy, and energy was something Evelyn rationed like a precious resource. The debt was paid off in February of 1957. She was 27 years old. She sat at her kitchen table that night, the same kitchen table her father had bought at a church sale in 1948, wobbling on one leg, shimmed up with a folded piece of cardboard. And she held the paid-in-full notice in both hands and waited to feel something. Relief, maybe. Or joy. Some kind of release she had been promising herself for 10 years. What she felt instead was terrifying, because the debt was gone, and now she could see what was left behind it. And what was left behind it was nothing. A small apartment above a dry goods store. A job that would never pay her fairly. A town that had watched her struggle for a decade without once offering her a hand. And ahead of her, stretching out like a road with no turns, more of the same. She thought about staying. A person can get used to almost anything if they've been doing it long enough. She knew where everything was in this life. She knew which floorboard creaked near the bathroom door, and which gas burner ran hot, and which neighbor would complain if she played the radio past 9. Familiarity is its own kind of comfort, even when it's miserable. She thought about staying for about 4 days. Then she picked up the Ohio Register and turned to the back pages. Most of the personal advertisements were predictable. Widowers seeking companionship. Men looking for women who were described as pleasant-natured and domestic, which Evelyn had learned was often a coded way of saying someone who won't argue with me. She read through them with the same expression she used when reviewing invoices: careful, skeptical, looking for errors. She almost missed the one at the bottom of the 3rd column. Colorado rancher, 38, seeks capable woman for honest partnership. No poetry. Brutal winters. Constant work. Complete isolation. I will tell you the truth about what this life is, and I expect the same in return. Gideon Hart, Box 7, Crestfall, Colorado. Evelyn read it 3 times. Then she clipped it out with scissors and folded it into her coat pocket and went back to work. She didn't write to him that week. She told herself she was thinking about it. She told herself she was being practical. In reality, she was afraid, not of the mountains or the isolation, but of wanting something too much. Wanting had always cost her. Every time she had let herself want something in this town, Shelby had found a way to take it away, or diminish it, or hand it to someone else. She had learned to hold hope at arm's length, the way you hold something that has burned you before. But she kept the clipping. She read it again on Sunday morning before the diner shift. She read it again on Tuesday, in the back office at the hardware store, while Daryl was up front explaining to a customer why he needed to buy the more expensive saw. No poetry, the man had written. She appreciated that more than she could explain. She wrote to Gideon Hart on a Wednesday evening in late March, sitting at her wobbling kitchen table with a cup of tea that had gone cold. She wrote 3 drafts. The first was too formal. It sounded like a business letter, which it was, but not exclusively. The second was too personal. She'd written 2 paragraphs about her father that she immediately crossed out because a stranger didn't need her grief, not yet. The third was honest. She told him she was 27, that she had spent a decade paying off a debt that wasn't originally hers, that she was a bookkeeper with practical skills and no illusions about romance, that she had never lived anywhere but Ohio, that she did not know the first thing about sheep but was not afraid to learn, that she wanted a life that was different from the one she had, and that she was tired enough of the current one to consider coming to a place she'd never seen to work alongside a man she'd never met. She asked him 2 questions. What had happened to whoever had been there before, and what did he actually need from a partner? She mailed it before she could change her mind. His reply came 2.5 weeks later. It was 3 pages, handwritten, in a script that was cramped and careful. The handwriting of someone who didn't write often, but took it seriously when he did. He answered both her questions without hesitating. The woman before her had been his wife, Clara. She had come from Denver, which Gideon described as a different world entirely, and she had stayed 4 winters before she left. He did not write about it with bitterness. He wrote about it with the flat, steady tone of someone who had made peace with a hard fact. She was not wrong to go, he wrote. This life is not for everyone. I understand that better now than I did then. Then he answered her second question. What I need is someone who can handle the books, manage the household through months of near total isolation, make decisions when I can't be reached, and not collapse when things go wrong. They always go wrong. I need someone who knows the difference between a problem that can wait and one that cannot. I can teach you everything about the ranch and the animals. I cannot teach you judgment. You either have it or you don't. From your letter, I think you might. Evelyn read that paragraph 4 times. She was not naive. She understood that this man was essentially conducting a job interview through the mail, that the words "I think you might" were not a declaration but a cautious, tentative assessment. She understood that she knew almost nothing about him. His voice, his temper, his habits, whether he was patient or cruel, whether he was honest in person the same way he seemed honest on paper. She understood all of that. She wrote back anyway. They exchanged 6 more letters over the following 2 months. Evelyn found herself reading his letters at the hardware store during her lunch break, which she ate at her desk because the break room smelled like cigarette smoke and Daryl's conversations. Gideon wrote about the valley the way someone writes about a thing they love and are also deeply frustrated by, with honesty and without embellishment. He wrote about losing 24 sheep to a sudden storm 3 winters ago and what that had cost him, financially and otherwise. He wrote about the nearest town being 2 hours away in good weather and not reachable at all during the worst of the season. He wrote about sleeping 9 hours a night in the summer and barely 5 in the winter because the work expanded to fill whatever time was available. She wrote back about her 10 years of debt. She wrote about the hardware store and Daryl and the coworker who had once told her she was too serious for a woman. She wrote about her father and what he had been before the loan, a man who laughed at his own jokes, who grew tomatoes in the backyard, who read her adventure stories before bed, even when she was probably too old for them. She wrote about what it had felt like to hand that final payment to the bank and feel absolutely nothing. His response to that particular letter was shorter than usual. Just 1 paragraph at the end stood out. I think nothing felt like something after all. I think what you felt was exactly what happens when you've been holding your breath so long. You've forgotten you're doing it. The nothing you're describing. I think that was the exhale. The question is what you breathe in next. She sat with that for a long time. When she finally told Daryl she was leaving, he looked at her the way people look at someone who has said something both surprising and mildly disappointing. Leaving for what? What? He asked, which told her everything she needed to know about how invisible she had successfully become. A ranch in Colorado, she said. He blinked. You don't know anything about ranching. I know, she said. I'll learn. Evelyn? He said it the way he always said it, slightly patronizing, slightly amused, as though she were a clever child who had just said something foolish. Think about this. You've got a job here, stability. You know people. She thought about Martha Holloway at the feed store. She thought about the break room that smelled like smoke. She thought about the identical Tuesday following the identical Monday for the next 30 years. I've thought about it, she said. She gave 2 weeks' notice. She paid her last month's rent. She sold the kitchen table, even the one that wobbled, and the spare chair and the lamp her aunt had given her that she'd never liked anyway. She packed what mattered into a single trunk: clothes, her mother's Bible, a small leather notebook she used for accounts, 3 books on animal husbandry and mountain climate she'd borrowed from the library and was planning, guiltily, to return late. On the morning she left, Mrs. Patterson stopped her on the sidewalk in front of the dry goods store. You're making a mistake, Mrs. Patterson said. She had the particular certainty of someone who had never made an interesting decision in her life. Maybe, Evelyn said. A woman your age. I'm 27, Mrs. Patterson. Going off to the middle of nowhere with a stranger. He's not a stranger. We've been corresponding for 2 months. Letters. Mrs. Patterson said the word like it was something unpleasant she'd found in her soup. Letters aren't people. Evelyn picked up her trunk handle. Her arms were stronger than they looked. 10 years of not having enough had made her practical and sturdy in ways people consistently underestimated. No, she agreed. They're not, but they're a start. She walked to the station. The train ride took 2 days with a change in St. Louis. Evelyn sat by the window and watched Ohio flatten out, and then rise and then flatten again, and then, somewhere past Kansas, begin to swell upward in ways that made her stomach do something unfamiliar. She ate the sandwiches she'd packed. She read her animal husbandry book. She slept in short intervals and woke each time to a landscape more dramatic than the one before it. She did not let herself imagine what he would look like, or what the valley would look like, or whether any of this was wise. Imagination was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. She needed facts, and the only way to get facts was to arrive. She arrived in Crestfall on a Tuesday afternoon in June. He was waiting at the station with a wagon and a horse and a face that looked like it had been weathered by something other than just the sun, like the mountains themselves had rubbed their roughness into his skin over the years. He was taller than she'd expected, quieter too. He shook her hand. Evelyn Mercer, he said. Gideon Hart, she said. That was it. That was the whole greeting. No pleased to meet you, no comment on her appearance or her luggage or whether she was tired from the journey. Just her name and his name, acknowledged. A simple confirmation that they were both who they'd said they were. She climbed up onto the wagon without waiting for him to offer a hand because she didn't need one, and because she wanted him to see that from the beginning. He noticed. She could tell by the way he didn't say anything about it. He just took up the reins and clicked to the horse and started moving. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The road climbed and climbed and climbed, and Evelyn, watching the peaks growing larger ahead of her, thought, I don't know what I'm doing. I have never known what I'm doing. I just keep moving anyway. She had been doing that her whole life. It was the only skill she'd ever fully trusted. The horse pulled them higher, and the world behind her. Shelby. Martha Holloway. Daryl and his condescension. 10 years of invisible labor, the paid-in-full notice on a wobbling kitchen table, fell away like something that had always been temporary. Ahead, through a gap in the granite ridgeline that looked too narrow to be an entrance to anything, something waited. She didn't know yet what it was, but she had stopped being afraid of not knowing. That, it turned out, was when things really began. The gap in the granite looked like a scar. That was the first thing Evelyn thought when the wagon rolled toward it. Not a passage, not a gate, but something the mountain had suffered once and never fully healed. The walls of stone on either side rose so steeply that the afternoon light died before it reached the ground. and for a long moment, riding through that narrow throat of rock, she felt the air change. Colder, denser, like breathing something that had never been breathed before. Then the walls opened up. She didn't gasp. She wasn't the gasping type. But her hand, which had been resting on her knee, tightened into a fist without her meaning it to. The valley was enormous. That was the only word that came, and it wasn't enough. It rolled out in front of them like something unfolded from a dream. Wide meadows, still summer green, a dark thread of river cutting through the middle, and on every side the mountains standing so close and so tall that the sky above was reduced to a long pale ribbon. The peaks had snow on them even in June. The shadows they cast were the size of towns. She sat with her fist closed on her knee and said nothing. Gideon didn't look at her to see her reaction. He kept his eyes on the trail, one hand loose on the reins, like a man who had stopped needing to look at the valley a long time ago. That told her something. Not that he didn't care about it. You don't stay in a place like this for years without caring. But that for him, the valley was simply where he lived. The wonder had been absorbed into the ordinary, the way all extraordinary things eventually are when you live alongside them long enough. "How big is it?" she asked. "The valley?" He considered. 11 miles end to end, maybe 4 across at the widest. "And you own?" "Southeast corner, about 300 acres. The rest is open range and federal land." She nodded. She was already doing arithmetic in her head, acreage, carrying capacity, the number of sheep she knew he ran from his letters, the rough figures on feed costs through a mountain winter. It was what her brain did when it was overwhelmed by something beautiful. It retreated into numbers, because numbers made sense, and beauty was just an emotion, and emotions had never paid a single bill in her life. The ranch came into view 20 minutes later. It was not what she had imagined, and she hadn't let herself imagine much. The main house was stone, low and solid-looking, the kind of building that had been constructed by someone who understood that elegance was a liability in this climate. A barn twice its size stood behind it, patched in several places with lumber that didn't quite match. There was a smaller outbuilding she couldn't identify, a fence line that ran in 3 directions, and beyond all of it, scattered across the lower meadow like gray-white boulders that had learned to move, the sheep. Hundreds of them. She hadn't quite understood from the letters how many hundreds. Gideon pulled the wagon up to the side of the house and set the brake. He climbed down and began unhitching the horse with the efficiency of a man who had done it 10,000 times. Evelyn climbed down on her own side, again without waiting. Her boots hit the ground and she took her first real look at the house up close. A stone step was cracked down the middle. The window frames needed paint. A shutter on the left side had come partially loose and was hanging at an angle that would make it useless against any serious wind. "I'll show you the inside," Gideon said. "What's in the small outbuilding?" she asked. He glanced over. "Feed storage. Half of it's been converted to a cold room. Does it hold temperature?" A pause. "Mostly. Mostly is a problem in winter." He looked at her then, really looked, for the first time since the station. Not unkindly, but with the careful attention of someone recalibrating something. "It is," he said. "I've been meaning to address it." "When?" "Before October." She nodded. October. That gave them roughly 4 months, which was not nothing. She filed it. The inside of the house was cleaner than she'd expected and more threadbare than she'd feared. One main room that served as kitchen, sitting area, and apparent office, judging by the stack of papers and ledgers on the table by the window. A short hallway leading to what she assumed were the sleeping rooms. A wood stove against the far wall that was the obvious center of the entire building. Everything in the room seemed oriented toward it. The floor was swept but unvarnished, worn smooth in the paths between the stove and the table and the door. She walked to the table and looked at the papers without touching them. "Those are the flock records," Gideon said from behind her. "And the accounts." She said nothing for a moment. The records were not bad exactly, but approximate. Numbers written in a way that showed someone who understood what he was tracking, but not necessarily the most efficient system for tracking it. She could see 2 different columns that were almost certainly measuring the same thing twice, and a third that didn't seem to connect to anything else on the page. "Do you want me to look at these now, or after I've settled in?" she asked. Another pause. She was starting to understand that his pauses weren't hesitation, they were consideration. He actually thought before he spoke, which was rarer than it should have been. "After," he said. "There's time." Her room was the smaller of the two sleeping rooms. A narrow bed, a wooden chest, a window that faced east. The mattress was newer than everything else in the house. She suspected he'd bought it specifically for her arrival, and the thought made something in her chest move in a way she immediately set aside. She unpacked her trunk slowly, hanging her dresses on the 3 hooks on the wall, setting her books on the windowsill, placing her notebook and pen on the corner of the chest. She stood her mother's Bible on the windowsill beside the books, spine out, and then stood there for a moment just looking at it. She was 30 miles from the nearest town. There was a man she barely knew in the next room. She had paid in full on one life and was holding the receipt for another that she couldn't yet read. She was terrified. She thought it was important to admit that, at least to herself, clearly and without decoration. She was terrified. She went and started reviewing the flock records. The first week was like learning a new language while simultaneously trying to pass an exam in it. The sheep, Gideon ran a mix of Rambouillet and a hardier mountain cross he'd developed over years, required a daily rhythm that she absorbed by following him without asking too many questions. She was not naturally quiet, but she was naturally observant, and she had learned in 10 years of bookkeeping that the most efficient way to understand a system was to watch it operate before you started suggesting improvements. She watched. She learned which ewes were dominant and how that changed the movement of the whole flock. She learned that the 2 dogs, Rook and a younger, more excitable animal named Stamp, were not pets, but working tools with their own hierarchy and communication, and that Gideon communicated with them in a series of whistles she began cataloging in her notebook. She learned that the mountain weather could shift inside of an hour, that a clear morning meant almost nothing about a clear afternoon, and that Gideon read the sky and the behavior of the sheep both as indicators. A restlessness in the flock sometimes predicted a storm better than the clouds did. At night, she worked on the records. She found the problems carefully, the way she'd found problems in Daryl's accounts, without drama, just following the numbers until they either resolved or didn't. By the end of her first week, she had identified 3 significant bookkeeping errors that had likely cost Gideon money he didn't know he was losing: a supply ordering pattern that was both wasteful and inefficient, and a feed calculation based on an old flock size that no longer reflected the current head count. She presented these findings on a Saturday evening after supper. Gideon read her notes. He was quiet for a long time. The lamp on the table between them made the room feel smaller than it was. "How much?" he asked finally. "Conservatively? The ordering pattern alone has probably been costing you $8 to $12 a month in unnecessary loss and spoilage. Over a year. Over a year that's close to $140. "Yes." He set the papers down. He didn't look angry. He looked like a man who had just learned he'd been carrying something heavier than necessary for a long time without knowing it. "I'm not criticizing the system," she said, because she felt she needed to. These records kept the ranch running. They just weren't designed by someone whose primary job was the records. "My primary job is the sheep," he said. "I know. That's exactly the problem I'm proposing to fix." He looked at her. "All right," he said. "Fix it." Those 2 words were, she realized later, the closest he ever came to a compliment. She fixed it. Over the following 2 weeks, she restructured the entire accounting system, designed a new supply inventory that cross-referenced the feed calculations with actual current flock count, and introduced a simple daily log that any of them could update quickly without needing to interpret her handwriting. She reorganized the cold storage building, identified which areas were losing temperature and why, and made a list of specific repairs in order of urgency. She also identified that the loose shutter was the least of the house's winter vulnerabilities. There was a section of the barn roof that had been patched with material that would not survive heavy snow loading. There was a gap in the foundation on the north side of the cold room that was currently admitting cold air, and would, she suspected, become a far more serious problem when the ground shifted in the freeze-thaw cycles of early winter. There were 3 fence sections in the lower pasture that would need reinforcement before the flock was pushed into closer winter quarters. She was methodical about all of it. She made lists. She prioritized. She did not suggest everything at once, because she understood, from watching him, from reading his silences, that Gideon Hart was a proud man in the way that people who have survived a great deal alone are proud. He was not arrogant, but there was a quiet stubbornness to him that said, "I have managed this far on my own," and she knew that if she pushed too fast or too hard, he would resist. Not because she was wrong, but because the pace of change felt like criticism. So she was careful. She brought him one problem at a time. She presented the evidence, her proposed solution, and the estimated cost. She asked for his opinion on the execution. She was right about the approach. He responded better to being consulted than directed, and she logged that detail in the back of her notebook, where she kept her observations about the ranch's human element as well as its physical one. What she didn't expect was Nora Calloway. Nora arrived on a Wednesday, 3 weeks after Evelyn, driving a small wagon with a horse that looked like it had opinions about the journey. She was somewhere in her 60s, with the kind of face that had been weathered into something handsome and sharp, and she had apparently been supplying Gideon with baked goods and unsolicited opinions for about 7 years. She pulled up to the house while Gideon was out with the flock, which Evelyn suspected was either coincidence or planning. "So you're the one," Nora said from the wagon seat, looking down at Evelyn with unconcealed curiosity. "I'm Evelyn Mercer," Evelyn said. "Can I help you with something?" "I brought bread." She held up a cloth-wrapped bundle. "I always bring bread. It's not for you specially, before you get any ideas." "I didn't have any ideas," Evelyn said. Nora climbed down from the wagon with the efficiency of a woman who had been climbing in and out of wagons since before Evelyn was born. She handed over the bread. She did not stop looking at Evelyn. "How long do you plan to stay?" Nora asked. "Indefinitely," Evelyn said. "Clara said the same thing." There it was. Evelyn had been wondering when Clara's name would come up. It had hovered over every conversation at the ranch like weather, present but unspoken. She had not asked Gideon about her again after the letters. His letter had been clear enough. His wife had left, and he hadn't blamed her. But there was a difference between what a person writes in a letter and what a person carries in their chest. "I'm not Clara," Evelyn said simply. "No," Nora said, looking at her with those sharp eyes. "You're not." She was softer. I don't mean that unkindly. She was a lovely woman, but soft isn't what this valley calls for. "What does this valley call for?" Nora was quiet for a moment. She looked out at the meadow, at the sheep in the far distance, at the peaks rising behind everything. "Staying," she said finally. "That's all. The ones who stay, they make it. The ones who can't, the mountain doesn't hate them for it. It just doesn't make exceptions." Evelyn thought about that for a long time after Nora's wagon disappeared back through the gap in the granite. The next morning, she asked Gideon about the roof section on the barn. He looked at her. Then he looked at the barn. Then he looked back at her with an expression she hadn't quite seen on him before. Not exactly warmth, but something adjacent to it. "I was going to get to it," he said. "When?" "I don't know, before October." "Everything is before October," she said. "We need a schedule." He was quiet. "All right," he said. "Make one." She made one. It was more work than she had estimated, which she noted and did not complain about. The barn roof took 4 days, during which Gideon worked alongside her on the scaffolding. She had not expected him to work beside her rather than ahead of her, and it recalibrated something in how she thought about him. He was not the kind of man who assigned tasks from a distance. He sweated through the same work he asked of anyone else, and he was better at it than he looked, which was saying something because he already looked capable. They didn't talk much while they worked. That turned out to be fine. The work itself was a kind of communication, the rhythm of it, who anticipated what, when to hand something over before it was asked for. She started to understand his physical language, the slight forward lean that meant he was about to do something that required her to move, the way he paused and looked at a problem from multiple angles before committing to an approach. She started to suspect that he was doing the same to her, reading her the way he read the sky or the sheep. By the time the roof was done, something had shifted. Not dramatically, not in any way she could have pointed to and named, but the quality of the silence between them had changed. It was less like the silence between two people who don't know each other, and more like the silence between two people who are beginning to. The community showed up in pieces after that. Not all at once, not with any kind of organized welcome, just people who materialized for reasons of their own. The neighboring rancher from 2 valleys over, a man named Douglas Peel, who rode over ostensibly to discuss a shared fence line, but spent most of his visit watching Evelyn with a speculative expression she found irritating. The Garvey family from lower down the mountain, who came for a reason that was never made entirely clear, but seemed to involve borrowing a tool and inspecting the new woman. A pair of brothers named Tatch, who had apparently supplied Gideon's wool transport for several seasons and arrived to discuss the coming year's arrangement while also, very transparently, trying to determine what kind of person had taken up residence at Hart Ridge. She handled all of them the same way, direct, polite, not warm exactly, because warmth would have looked like an audition, and she wasn't auditioning for anyone's approval. She answered questions honestly. She did not perform humility. She did not perform capability either. She just was what she was, and let them draw their conclusions. She heard the conclusions secondhand through Gideon, who reported them with an economy of expression that she was starting to appreciate. "Douglas Peel thinks you're too serious," he said one evening. "What did you say?" "I said serious wasn't a liability up here." She looked at him. He looked at the stove. Neither of them said anything else about it. She found the second account ledger by accident in mid-August. She had been looking for a supply receipt she needed to reconcile and had gone through the drawer in the table more thoroughly than usual, and her hand had found it pushed to the very back, behind a stack of older receipts and what appeared to be a land survey from years ago. She almost put it back without opening it. She didn't. It was a different kind of ledger than the operating account she'd been managing. This one tracked something else, a set of transactions going back 9 years, in a hand that was careful and deliberate, recording payments received and a corresponding series of entries she couldn't immediately interpret. The amounts were significant, not enormous but consistent, and they didn't match any of the supply or equipment accounts she'd reconstructed. She sat with it for a while. Then she closed it and put it back exactly where she'd found it. She didn't ask Gideon about it that night. She thought about how to ask. She thought about whether asking was her place. She was the bookkeeper, yes, but there was a difference between the account she'd been given access to and a ledger that someone had deliberately placed at the back of a drawer. People had private finances. People had arrangements and histories that predated her arrival and didn't require her involvement. But the amounts were significant, and if she was going to do this job properly, in a valley where the margin for error in winter was essentially zero, she needed to know what she was actually looking at. She asked him 2 days later. In the morning, before they went out to the sheep, because she'd noticed he was more receptive to difficult conversations in the morning than in the evening, when the day's accumulated weight made him quieter and more closed. She put the ledger on the table between them. "I found this," she said. He looked at it. Something moved across his face. Not quite surprise, not quite alarm. More like the expression of someone who has been waiting for a question and isn't entirely sure how to begin answering it. "Where?" he said. "Back of the drawer. I was looking for the Thompson supply receipt." He sat down. I was quiet for a long time, which was not unusual for him, but which this morning felt different, heavier. "That's a separate arrangement," he said finally. "I can see that." "What kind of arrangement?" Another long pause. She waited without filling it. She had learned that filling his pauses was counterproductive. "When I bought this land," he said slowly, "the original parcel was larger, 3 tracts. I sold the middle tract to a land company about 8 years ago." He paused again. "The middle tract had something on it. The company knew what they were buying. The payment structure was part of the arrangement. They didn't want a lump sum on record, didn't want to draw attention." "Draw attention to what?" He looked at her. His eyes were steady but guarded. "There's silver on that parcel," he said. "Has been for as long as anyone has known about this valley. I've known about it since I bought the land. So did the company." The room was very quiet. "And the payments," she said, "are from the mining operation." "A percentage?" "Yes. It was the only way I could afford to buy the remaining tracts outright." He stopped. "I should have told you." "About the ledger." "Yes," she said. "You should have." "I wasn't sure." He stopped again. "You weren't sure I'd stay," she said. Not accusingly, just naming it. He didn't deny it. "I've had reasons before to tell someone the full picture of this place," he said, "and it hasn't always helped." She thought about Clara, about a woman who had come from Denver, who had been lovely and soft, who had stayed 4 winters. She thought about what it would mean to someone to be told, in year 2 or year 3, that the land they were living on was part of a mining arrangement that the owner had deliberately kept quiet. She thought about what that would feel like. Not like a revelation, but like a door you thought you'd walk through that turned out to have been locked all along. "I'm not going to pretend that's not significant," she said. "I know. And I'm not going to pretend I'm not bothered by it. I know that too." She sat down across from him. She looked at the ledger. She looked at him. "Is there anything else?" she asked. He held her gaze. "No," he said. "That's everything." She believed him. Not because she was naive. She was not naive. She had never had the luxury of naivete. But because she had been reading this man for 3 months now, through letters and silences and long days of shared work, and she had developed what she believed was a reasonably accurate sense of when he was being straight with her. He was a man who withheld things sometimes, but she did not think he was a man who actively lied. "Then I'm going to add this to the operating accounts," she said. "The income, the percentage arrangement, the timeline, all of it. It needs to be part of the full picture." "All right." "And if there's ever anything else you've kept in a separate drawer," she said, "I'd rather know about it on your terms than find it on mine." He nodded, just once. But the nod meant something. She could feel the weight of it. She picked up the ledger and carried it to her table by the window and opened her notebook to a fresh page. Behind her, she heard him get up from the table and go out to begin the morning's work. She sat with the numbers for a while, working through the arrangement methodically, translating it into a form that made sense alongside everything else. The silver payments didn't change the ranch's fundamental operation. The sheep were still the sheep, the work was still the work. But they changed the margin. They added a buffer that she hadn't known was there. And in a place where the margin for winter survival was as thin as it was, a buffer was not a small thing. She added it to the full account. Then she added a note at the bottom of the page in her small, careful handwriting. Full picture received. Accounting complete as of August 14th. She closed the notebook. Outside, she could hear Gideon's whistle for rook, 2 short notes, 1 long, and the distant sound of the flock beginning to move. She had no idea, sitting there in the morning light with the mountain quiet around her and the wool smell drifting in through the gap under the door, that the ledger in the back of the drawer was the smallest of the valley's secrets. She had no idea that the silver arrangement was only the first layer of something that went considerably deeper, that the land company who had bought the middle tract was not simply a land company, that the name on the original purchase agreement, if she ever went looking for it, would tell her something about the valley's history that Gideon Hart had not put in any of his letters. She didn't know any of that yet. What she knew was that it was August, the roof was solid, the accounts were honest, the cold room needed 2 more weeks of work to be reliably sealed, and she had approximately 60 days before the first serious weather. She closed the ledger. She picked up her coat. She went outside to help with the sheep. 60 days turned out to be optimistic. The first serious weather arrived on the 3rd of October, which was 18 days earlier than Gideon said it had ever come in his 11 years at Hart Ridge. He said it the way he said most things, matter-of-factly, without alarm. But Evelyn had learned enough about this man to understand that matter-of-fact was his register for things that actually concerned him. The more serious the situation, the quieter and flatter his voice became. It was the opposite of how most people operated, and it had taken her a while to calibrate to it. She had calibrated to it. "How early?" she asked. They were standing outside looking at the sky to the northwest, which had gone the color of a bruise overnight. 18 days, maybe 20, he said. "What does 18 days mean for the lower pasture flock?" "It means we needed to move them last week." She was already turning toward the barn. "Then we moved them today. The north holding pen won't fit all of them." "How short are we?" 40, maybe 50 head. She thought for 3 seconds. "The east barn extension, the storage section we cleared in September. What's its current condition?" He looked at her. "It's not fitted for animals. It's 4 walls and a roof. What's its current condition?" Another pause. "It would hold short term. Then we fit it for animals this morning and moved the flock this afternoon." She paused. "Unless you have a better option." He didn't answer immediately. She had learned that his silences were not always consideration. Sometimes they were the sound of a proud man accepting that someone else had the right answer. She waited without pressing. "We'll need the Tatch brothers," he said finally. "Can't move that many in one push with just the 2 of us and the dogs." "Can you reach them today?" "I'll ride out now." He was already moving toward the horse. "Gideon!" He stopped. She looked at the sky again. "How bad is this one going to be?" He followed her gaze. He stood there for a moment with his hands loose at his sides, reading whatever he read in those clouds. "Bad enough," he said. He rode out. She went to the east barn extension with a hammer, a box of nails she'd cataloged in the supply inventory 3 weeks ago, and a patience she did not entirely feel. The Tatch brothers arrived by mid-morning, Walt and his younger brother Cy, who was perhaps 22 and had the energy of someone who had not yet learned that physical work accumulated. They moved the flock through the afternoon in 2 pushes, the dogs working the edges while the 4 of them covered the gaps. It was loud and chaotic, and nothing like the efficient operation she'd imagined when she planned it, because moving several hundred sheep was never efficient, not really. It was organized chaos at best, and you accepted the chaos as part of the cost. By the time the last animals were secured, the sky had gone from bruised to something closer to black at the edges, and the temperature had dropped 15 degrees since morning. Evelyn could feel the cold settling into her coat in a new way. Not the cool of altitude she'd gotten used to, but something with intent behind it. Walt Tatch, accepting a cup of coffee in the kitchen afterward, looked at her with an expression that was either respect or reassessment. "You planned that pretty quick," he said. "We had the time," she said. "We just hadn't used it yet." Walt looked at Gideon. Gideon looked at his coffee. Cy, who was young enough to say what the older people were only thinking, said, "Most of the women who've come through here couldn't have organized that." "I'm not most women," Evelyn said. Not unkindly, just as a fact. Cy nodded, apparently satisfied. Walt looked at her for another moment, and then something settled in his expression. Some verdict reached, and he returned to his coffee without further comment. The storm arrived that night. It announced itself first as sound, a low, sustained moan that came not from any direction she could identify, but from everywhere at once, as though the valley itself were the instrument being played. Then the wind hit the house, and the house answered with its own sounds, a series of creaks and stresses that she lay awake cataloging against the repair work she'd done, mentally checking each one against the reinforcements. The roof held. The shutter, which Gideon had reattached in September after she'd pointed it out for the 3rd time, held. The gap in the cold room foundation, which she'd sealed herself with a material the supply man in Crestfall had initially tried to talk her out of on the basis that it was typically used for a different purpose, held. The storm lasted 3 days. When it cleared, it left 4 feet of snow in the lower meadow, and a silence so complete it had texture. Evelyn stood outside the morning after it ended and listened to that silence. She had grown up in a town where silence meant something was wrong. No traffic, no voices, no background hum of people going about their business meant emergency, meant someone was ill, meant some communal crisis had suspended normal life. Out here, silence was just what happened when the noise stopped. It was the valley's resting state. She was not used to it, and she suspected she would never entirely be used to it, but she had stopped fighting it. She was learning to stand inside it without flinching. They lost 2 sheep in the storm. Not from exposure, the holding arrangements had worked, but from a trampling incident in the crowded north pen that neither the dogs nor the 2 of them could have prevented without a 3rd pair of hands. Gideon found them in the morning, and he was quiet about it, in the way he was quiet about things that cost him, not just financially, but in some other register she was still learning to read. 2 out of 430, she said when he told her. "Still 2, he said, dead. "Yes," she said, "still 2. And if we hadn't moved them yesterday, it would have been worse." He knew that. She knew he knew that. But she said it anyway because she had learned that sometimes a man needed to hear the arithmetic made explicit, not because he couldn't do it himself, but because grief, even small grief, tends to make the math feel worse than it is. He nodded once and went out to begin the morning work. November settled over the valley like a decision. The second storm came 10 days after the first, and this one was more serious. 7 days of snowfall that reduced visibility to nearly nothing and made outdoor work both difficult and genuinely dangerous. Evelyn had established a rope line between the house and the barn in late October, running between fixed posts so that moving between the 2 buildings in whiteout conditions didn't require trusting your sense of direction, which the wind made entirely unreliable. Gideon had watched her set the first post without comment, and by the 3rd post he had picked up a shovel and was helping without being asked. That was how most things went between them now. She identified the problem, proposed the solution, and he came in alongside the execution without the preliminary negotiation they'd needed in the early weeks. They had stopped needing to establish who was right. They had started just fixing things. It was during the second storm, on the 4th day, that the land company men arrived. She heard the knock and answered it, which surprised them visibly. Two men in coats that were good quality but wrong for mountain weather, standing on the cleared path to the door with the particular look of people who had expected something different from who opened the door. "We're looking for Gideon Hart," the taller one said. His name, she'd later learn, was Aldous Fenn. He had the kind of face that was handsome in a sharp, calculated way, and he used it consciously. "He's at the barn," she said. "What's this about?" "A business matter. If you could get him." "I manage the accounts for this ranch," she said. "Any business matter that involves Hart Ridge comes through me." "What's this about?" Fenn looked at the other man, shorter, rounder, less at ease in the cold, a man named Garrett, who seemed to exist primarily to carry the bag Fenn didn't want to carry himself. "It's regarding the land arrangement," Fenn said, with a careful pleasantness that told her immediately this was not a social call. "The silver parcel." She stepped back from the door. "Come in." She did not go get Gideon. She sat them at the table and put the kettle on and got out the ledger. The separate one. The one she'd found in the back of the drawer and had spent the past 6 weeks fully integrating into the ranch's accounts. And she opened it to the current page and set it in front of her and waited. Fenn was not quite prepared for that. She could see him recalibrating. "Miss," he began. Mercer, she said. "Evelyn Mercer. I manage the accounts." "Mrs. Hart." "Miss Mercer," she said without heat. "Mr. Hart and I are business partners." "Now, what's the matter with the arrangement?" What was the matter with the arrangement, it emerged over the next 40 minutes, was that the land company, Fenn represented a firm called Consolidated Range, which Evelyn had already looked up in the legal notices she'd found in a stack of old Crestfall papers in the storage room, wanted to renegotiate the percentage. They had been paying Gideon 8% of the silver extraction value. They now wanted to reduce that to 3%. Their reasoning, presented by Fenn with the practiced smoothness of someone who did this professionally, was a combination of changed extraction costs, market fluctuations, and a legal reinterpretation of the original agreement that Fenn presented as though it were an established fact rather than a position they were advocating. She listened to all of it without interruption. Then she said, "The original agreement was registered with the county recorder in Crestfall in September of 1948. The percentage is fixed for a term of 20 years, and the agreement includes a clause, Clause 7, Paragraph 2, that explicitly prohibits unilateral renegotiation during the term without the written consent of both parties. Do you have his written consent?" Fenn looked at her. "The clause you're referring to is right here," she said, and turned the ledger to the page where she had copied the relevant section of the original agreement in full, which she had obtained by sending a letter to the county recorder's office in Crestfall 6 weeks ago, after she'd found the ledger in the back of the drawer and spent 2 evenings understanding exactly what it was. She had not told Gideon she'd requested the official copy. She had filed it under legal correspondence in the new account system and not made a point of it. Fenn read the clause. His expression did not change, but something behind it did. "Miss Mercer," he said, "this is a complex arrangement. There are aspects of it that 8%, she said, through 1968, as agreed." Fenn looked at Garrett. Garrett looked at his hat. "I'll need to consult with the firm," Fenn said. "Of course," she said pleasantly. "The door is that way." She stood. They stood. Garrett picked up the bag he'd set down. Fenn took one more look at the ledger page, at her careful handwriting, at the full clause laid out line by line in a hand that made clear this was not a lucky guess, but a prepared position. He nodded. Once. The nod of a man conceding a round without conceding the match. They left. The door had been closed approximately 30 seconds when Gideon came in from the barn, stamping snow off his boots, and stopped when he saw her standing at the table with the ledger. "There were men here," he said. It wasn't a question. He'd obviously seen the tracks in the snow. "From Consolidated Range," she said. "They wanted to drop the silver percentage to 3%. He went very still. "What did you tell them?" "I told them 8% through 1968, as per Clause 7, Paragraph 2 of the original agreement." She paused. "They're going to consult with the firm. They'll be back." He stared at her. "You knew about Clause 7. "I requested a copy of the agreement from the county recorder in September," she said, "after I found the ledger. I should have told you. I was—" She stopped. "I wanted to understand it fully before I said anything. I didn't want to raise an issue I didn't know how to address." Another of his long silences. But this one had a different quality from any of the ones before it. This one felt like he was seeing something he hadn't let himself see before. They came here during the storm, he said. Yes. They thought... He stopped. They thought they'd find you alone, she said, or find whoever was here unprepared. She closed the ledger. They were wrong on both counts. He sat down at the table. He sat there for a moment with his hands flat on the surface, looking at nothing in particular, and she watched him absorb it. The visit, the challenge, the fact that it had been handled in his absence by a woman who had arrived with a trunk and 3 library books 4 months ago. Thank you, he said. It was the first time he had said those words to her directly. She had noticed. Don't thank me yet, she said. They'll come back with a lawyer. I know. We should get one of our own. In Crestfall? The county seat. Someone who knows land law. She sat down across from him. The percentage income matters. Not just for the margin. It's part of what makes this ranch viable through a bad year. We can't let them renegotiate it. Not now. He looked at her. Why not now specifically? Because bad years are coming, she said. I don't know when, but I've been watching the weather patterns in your old records and talking to Nora, and bad years come in clusters up here. When they come, the sheep income alone won't cover everything. The percentage is the buffer. He was quiet for a moment. Then, Nora talks to you? Nora talks to anyone who listens properly. Evelyn paused. She told me about the winter of 1944, when the previous owner of this property lost the whole flock. I know about that winter. The percentage arrangement, the fact that you sold that parcel and structured it the way you did, that was smart, she said. It was not easy for her to say, not because she didn't believe it, but because she wasn't naturally given to direct compliments. It was forward-thinking. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite classify. Clara thought I should have kept the land and found another way to finance. The name still landed between them differently from any other word. She didn't look away from it. Clara wasn't wrong about the value of the land, Evelyn said carefully, but she may not have known what the alternative financing would have cost in a bad year. She didn't know about the silver, Gideon said. I told her about the sale, and I didn't tell her why the parcel was valuable. He paused. I thought if I told her there was silver, that we were living in a valley that had silver in it, she'd want things to be different. She'd start measuring what we had against what we could have had. Evelyn sat with that for a moment. It was the most he'd ever said about Clara in one sitting, and she recognized it for what it was. Not quite an explanation, not quite an apology. Something in between. It doesn't matter now, she said. What matters now is the lawyer. He nodded. The subject of Clara closed, neither of them turning the lock, both of them understanding it was closed. The lawyer they found in Crestfall, a woman named Ruth Halder, which surprised both of them and delighted Evelyn in a way she kept to herself, reviewed the agreement and confirmed everything Evelyn had told Fenn. The clause was airtight. Consolidated Range came back in December as predicted with their own legal representation and a revised argument, and Ruth Halder disposed of the revised argument in 2 letters. The percentage stood. December was, in many ways, harder than November, not because of the legal business, that was resolved cleanly, but because December was when the isolation became real. Not the physical isolation of the passes being cut off, which they were, the road to Crestfall buried under snow that no wagon and no horse was going to move through without serious risk. The isolation Evelyn hadn't prepared for was something else. The specific compression of living in close quarters with one other person, day after day, in a space that was comfortable but small, with the world reduced to the valley walls and the sound of wind, and whatever the two of them could find to say to each other. She had not lived in close proximity to another person in 10 years. Not since her father died and she moved to the apartment above the dry goods store, where the nearest human being was 1 floor down and effectively another world. Gideon was difficult, not unkind, but difficult. He had habits she had not anticipated. He left things in specific places that seemed random, but were apparently meaningful to him. And if she moved them while cleaning, which she did because she cleaned the way she did everything, methodically, he would come in and stand looking at the displaced object with an expression of such quiet distress that she finally asked him about it. The lamp, she said one evening. I moved it to the left side of the table. It bothered you. I didn't say anything. I know, you stood there looking at it. He was quiet for a moment. My father always kept the lamp on the right side of the table, he said. He said the light was better for reading that way. I don't know. It doesn't make logical sense. Put it back on the right, she said. I'll clean around it. He moved the lamp to the right side of the table. He stood there for a second after he'd done it, with his hand on the base, not quite looking at her. Thank you, he said. It's a lamp, she said. Pick your arguments. He almost smiled. It was the closest she'd seen him come to it. Not a full smile, more like the idea of one, tried on briefly and then set down. She had habits he found difficult, too. She knew this not because he said so directly, but because she knew herself well enough to know which of her tendencies were likely to chafe in close quarters. She worked very early in the morning. She'd always been a 4:30 in the morning person, another consequence of years of doing more work than she had hours for. And the sounds of her moving around the kitchen before dawn bothered his sleep in a way he never mentioned, but that she could read in the slight tenseness around his eyes at breakfast. She started getting up at 5 instead. It wasn't a sacrifice exactly. It was arithmetic. This was a small house. They found rhythms, small specific agreements between two people who were not naturally built for comfortable cohabitation, but who were both pragmatic enough to make adjustments in the service of a working situation. They were not always kind to each other. There were days when she was short with him over something that had nothing to do with him. Days when he was so closed and inaccessible that she felt like she was sharing space with a wall. Days when the length of the winter and the sameness of it made them both sharp in ways they didn't quite apologize for, because the apologies would have required discussing things they hadn't established the language for yet. But they managed. That was the honest word for it. They managed, in the way that people who are serious about something manage. Not gracefully, not without friction, but persistently. The worst night of December was not the coldest or the stormiest. It was a still night, clear and absolutely freezing, when Evelyn woke at 2 in the morning to a sound she hadn't heard before and couldn't immediately identify. She lay in the dark, listening. The sound came again, something irregular, somewhere between a low groan and a crack. She got up. She put on her coat over her nightclothes and her boots without fully lacing them and went out into the hall. Gideon's door was already open. He was standing in the kitchen with the lantern, and his face told her before he said anything that this was serious. "The north pen wall," he said. "The snow load on the roof is—" She was already reaching for the second lantern. They went out into a cold so pure and sharp it felt like something you could cut yourself on. The night was clear and starlit, which was beautiful and completely irrelevant, and the sound she'd heard from her bed was the sound of the structural post on the east side of the north pen, beginning to fail under the weight of 3 feet of accumulated snow on the roof. The sheep were moving. She could hear it. The collective agitation, 150 animals registering something wrong the way animals always did, earlier and more precisely than the humans around them. "If that post goes," she started. "The whole east section could come down," he said. He was already calculating. She could see it in his face, the same arithmetic she was running. "We need to get them out of there before—" "The east barn extension," she said. "It'll be crowded, but it'll hold. We'll lose animals in the dark, moving that many—" "Rook can work the line. I'll take the left, you take the right. We move them fast and we don't lose any to the gaps." She looked at him. "It'll work. You haven't done a night move." "I've watched you do them. I know the signals." He looked at her for 1 second. In the lantern light, in the cold, in the middle of the night with the post groaning behind them and the sheep beginning to press against each other in the confined space. "Left flank," he said. "Stay within whistling distance. Go." They went. It was the hardest thing she had done since arriving at Hart Ridge, and she had done a great many hard things. Moving 150 sheep in the dark, in temperatures that made every breath hurt, across a path of compacted snow that was treacherous enough in daylight. It was not something she could have done without Rook, who worked the left edge with a focus and intelligence that she found genuinely awe-inspiring, and not something she could have done without Gideon's whistles cutting through the dark, keeping the rhythm, setting the pace. She lost her footing twice. The second time she went down hard on her right knee and the pain was immediate and serious. But she got up because there was no alternative to getting up, and she kept her position on the left flank, and she did not call out. And by the time the last animal had been pushed through the extension door and the latch dropped, She was shaking from cold and adrenaline and something else she didn't have a name for. Gideon dropped the latch and turned and found her leaning against the barn wall with her hand on her knee. "You're hurt," he said. "I fell," she said. "I'm all right. Let me—" "I'm all right," she said again. Not sharply, but clearly. He stopped. He looked at her in the lantern light, really looked, the way he had looked at her in the wagon on the first day, that recalibrating assessment, and then he nodded, accepting her word on the matter. "The post," she said. "Can we brace it tonight, or does it wait until morning?" He looked toward the north pen. "It'll hold until morning if the wind doesn't come up." "Then we're done for tonight." "Yes." They stood there for a moment in the dark, both of them breathing hard, the cold pressing in from every direction. The sheep were settling behind the barn wall. She could hear them, and the valley was otherwise absolutely silent. "The signals," he said after a moment. "What about them?" "You read them right. Every one." She looked at him. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the barn or the sky or something in between. "I've been watching you work since June," she said. "I know." A pause. "That's not what I mean." She waited, but he didn't say what he meant. He picked up the lantern and turned toward the house, and she followed, her knee aching with every step, and neither of them said anything else until they were inside. He heated water without being asked and set a basin and a cloth on the table and then took himself to the far side of the room with his back turned, which was, she understood, his version of privacy. She cleaned the cut on her knee, which was deeper than she'd wanted it to be and would be an ugly bruise for a week, and she wrapped it herself. When she was done, she sat at the table for a moment in the lamp-warm kitchen, listening to the valley's silence. She had moved 150 sheep in the dark in the middle of a Colorado winter and not lost one. She had faced down a land company lawyer with a county records copy and a steady voice. She had sealed a cold room foundation, reinforced a barn roof, restructured 11 years of deficient bookkeeping, held her position in a room full of people who had expected her to be temporary, and gotten up every morning since June in a world entirely unlike any she had known, and done the work that needed doing. She had also fallen on her knee in the snow and cried for about 30 seconds in the dark before getting up, because she was human, and she was tired, and there was nobody out there on the left flank to see her. She did not write that part in the notebook. She put out the lamp and went to bed, and the valley held its silence around the little stone house, and the sheep settled in the east barn extension, and somewhere in the room across the hall, Gideon Hart lay awake in the dark, thinking something he hadn't said, and the winter pressed on. The knee healed in 10 days. Evelyn did not rest it the way she should have, which she knew and did anyway, because the work didn't pause for injuries, and she was not the kind of person who could sit and watch someone else do what she was capable of doing herself, even when capable was a generous description of her current physical state. Gideon noticed. He redistributed the outdoor tasks in a way that was never stated as accommodation. He simply started doing the things that required more walking without making a point of it, adjusting the daily division of labor with the same quiet efficiency he applied to everything physical. She noticed what he was doing and did not comment on it, because commenting would have required him to acknowledge it, and acknowledgement would have made it a gesture rather than just a thing he was doing, and she suspected he preferred it the second way. She filed it. She was still keeping her notes in the back of the notebook, the observations about the ranch's human element. The entry for that week was short. Adjusts without being asked. Doesn't want credit. Note: January arrived and the valley became a different kind of place. It was not worse than December, exactly. The temperatures were comparable, the storms similarly relentless. But January had a particular quality that Evelyn hadn't encountered in any of Gideon's letters or Nora's stories or her own animal husbandry books. It was the quality of endurance without visible end. December you could survive by counting toward Christmas, by some internal calendar that marked the weeks as progress. In January, that mechanism broke down. The weeks stopped feeling like progress and started feeling like repetition. And the valley closed in, not physically, but atmospherically, in a way that Evelyn felt in her chest before she felt it anywhere else. She was not, she discovered, immune to it. She had thought she might be. She had survived 10 years of repetition in Shelby without breaking, 10 years of the same hardware store, the same accounts, the same faces, the same particular brand of being overlooked. She had thought that had trained her for isolation, for the long, unmarked stretches. What she had not understood was that there was a difference between the repetition of invisibility, where no one was depending on you and nothing required your full presence, and the repetition of responsibility, where every day your decisions affected animals and structures and another person's livelihood, and the weight of that never actually rested. She woke up one morning in the second week of January and lay in bed and could not immediately find a reason to get up. It lasted maybe 4 minutes. Then she got up because there were sheep to be checked and accounts to update, and the east barn extension latch had been sticking since the temperature dropped, and she needed to look at it before it became a problem. She got up and she did the work, and the 4 minutes of lying there receded into the general accumulation of the day. But she didn't write it in the notebook. Some things were not for the notebook. That afternoon, Gideon came in from the upper pasture earlier than usual. She was at the table working on the quarterly projections she'd started preparing, a practice that hadn't existed at Hart Ridge before her arrival, and which she had introduced without announcement simply by doing it when she heard his boots on the step and then the particular sound of him not coming straight inside, which meant something was wrong. She went to the door. He was standing on the cleared path, looking toward the northeast ridge. His posture had the specific quality she had learned to read as serious, not tense, but settled, a man planting himself in the face of something. "What is it?" she said. "There's a ewe up on the shelf pasture," he said. "She went through the fence on the upper section. I don't know how long she's been up there." The shelf pasture was a flattish section of ground about 400 feet above the main valley floor, accessible via a trail that was, in January, genuinely treacherous. She had been up there twice in better weather. She had not been up there since November. "How certain are you she's still up there?" she asked. "I could see her from the ridge. She's down. I couldn't tell if she's hurt or just trapped in the snowpack." "The dogs can't work that trail in this condition," she said. "Not enough traction." "No." "Can you get to her alone?" He looked at her. "I'd rather have someone on the bottom section of the trail in case I need to lower her on a line. She might be carrying. The ewe might be pregnant. If she was carrying and she'd been exposed overnight on the shelf in January temperatures, the lamb was almost certainly already lost. But the ewe might still be saved." "Give me 5 minutes," she said. She put on everything she owned that was warm and laced her boots properly and found the second rope in the barn and coiled it over her shoulder, and they went up the trail. The trail was, she had no adequate word for it. It was ice under snow, which was the worst possible combination, and the wind at the upper section was a different animal entirely from the wind in the valley, sharper, more directional, with a spite to it. Went up behind Gideon, one hand on the rock face wherever there was rock face to put it on. And she did not look down, not because she was afraid of heights, but because looking down was not useful, and she had a firm policy about doing only useful things when the situation was serious. He reached the shelf first, and she came up over the edge 15 seconds behind him and immediately saw the ewe, gray-white against the snow, down on her side about 30 yards from the fence breach, her head up, which was a good sign. Down, but alert. "She's carrying," Gideon said. He was already moving toward her. The examination took 2 minutes. The ewe was cold, but not yet critically hypothermic. She'd found a slight depression in the snow that had given her some wind shelter. The lamb, when he checked, was still viable. Barely, but viable. "We need to move her," he said. "Now, before she goes further down." Getting a frightened, pregnant ewe down an icy mountain trail on a rope was not something that appeared in any of Evelyn's animal husbandry books. She improvised, holding the lower section of the rope braced around her own body as a belay, while Gideon controlled the animal from above, and 3 times the ewe lurched, and she absorbed the pull with her whole weight, and once she came within about 2 feet of the edge of the trail and found something in herself that was steadier than fear. They got the ewe down. She was shaking by the time they reached level ground, and her hands were so cold she had to squeeze them deliberately to make sure they were still working. She didn't say any of that. She helped get the animal into the warm section of the barn, checked that she was stabilizing, confirmed with Gideon that the lamb was likely still salvageable if the ewe recovered fully in the next 12 hours. Then she went inside and stood at the stove and held her hands over the heat until the shaking stopped. Gideon came in 20 minutes later. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at her. "You held that line," he said. "Yes." When she lurched the second time, "I held it," she said. He came in and closed the door. He moved to the other side of the stove and stood there, warming his own hands. They stood on opposite sides of the stove in silence for a while. "I was going to ask Walt Tatch to come with me," he said. "I decided not to wait." She understood what he was saying. He had decided she could do it. "The lamb?" she said. "I'll check in an hour. If she's nursing by morning, they'll both make it." She nodded. She turned her hands over, warming the backs now. "The fence on the upper section needs to be on the spring priority list. I'll add it. I want to redesign the whole upper perimeter before the flock goes back up there. The current line relies on post spacing that isn't adequate for the snow loading." "All right." She looked at him across the stove. "You could push back sometimes, you know. You don't have to agree with everything I say." He looked back at her. "I push back when you're wrong." "When have I been wrong?" He thought about it, genuinely, not as a rhetorical exercise. "In September, you wanted to reconfigure the feed storage before fixing the roof. The roof was higher priority. I acknowledged that. After I said so." "That counts as me being wrong," she said. "Fine." Something in his face moved. Not quite the almost smile from December, something a little fuller. It was gone before she could pin it down, but she'd seen it, she noted it, not in the notebook. Somewhere else, somewhere less organized, somewhere she didn't fully have access to yet. The ewe was nursing by morning. The lamb, a small, furious, entirely healthy female, arrived in the world making a noise completely disproportionate to her size, which Evelyn found privately gratifying, and stood up on her own within the hour. Gideon found Evelyn in the barn during the pre-dawn check, watching the lamb nurse, and stood beside her for a moment without saying anything. "You gonna name her?" Evelyn asked. "I don't name them," he said. "Why not?" "Because then you name the ones that don't make it." She hadn't thought of that. It was the kind of answer that sounded simple and wasn't. She looked at the lamb, small and damp and furious and alive, and didn't say anything else about naming. February brought Aldous Fenn back. He arrived with a different companion this time. Not Garrett with his bag, but a man named Silas Croft, who had the look of someone employed specifically for situations that had moved past the persuasion stage. Croft was broad and quiet, and said almost nothing during the entire visit, which Evelyn found more concerning than if he'd been loud. Fenn's new position, presented this time with less smoothness and more of the underlying machinery showing, was that Consolidated Range intended to pursue a formal challenge to the original land agreement based on a surveying dispute regarding the exact boundary of the middle parcel. If the boundary could be shown to include a section of what was currently Gideon's West pasture, they would argue that the silver operation had been underreported and the original purchase price should be renegotiated, which would in turn allow them to reopen the percentage arrangement. It was, Evelyn recognized immediately, a significantly more sophisticated attack than the first one. This one didn't try to change the agreement. It tried to change the ground beneath the agreement. She let Fenn finish. Then she said, "The original survey was conducted by Harold Pence of Crestfall in August of 1948 and registered with the county alongside the sale agreement. Are you disputing Mr. Pence's survey?" "There are questions," Fenn said carefully, "about the methodology." "Harold Pence has been the county surveyor in Crestfall for 23 years, she said. "If Consolidated Range wants to dispute his methodology, they are welcome to do that in the Crestfall County Court." She paused. "I'd recommend bringing a thorough argument." Fenn looked at Croft. Croft looked at nothing in particular. "Miss Mercer," Fenn said, and this time the pleasantness was gone from his voice entirely, replaced by something more direct. "You've been here less than a year. This arrangement predates your involvement. I wonder if you fully understand—" "I understand it completely," she said. "I've read every document related to this property that is available in the public record, and several that aren't. I've spoken with Ruth Halder, who I think you're familiar with, and I manage the accounts for this operation, which means I have a clear picture of what this percentage income represents to the viability of Hart Ridge." She looked at him steadily. "Now, is there something specific you'd like me to relay to Mr. Hart, or can I tell him you'll be filing with the county court?" Fenn stood up. He was not a man accustomed to being handled, and he didn't like it, and he was letting that show now in a way he hadn't before. "You should understand," he said, and his voice had an edge to it that she recognized as the edge people use when they want to convey a threat without technically making one, that Consolidated Range has significant resources and a long history in this county. Mr. Hart has operated on the margins of those resources for years. That's been a comfortable arrangement for everyone. He paused. Comfortable arrangements can change. The room was quiet. Evelyn could hear the stove. She could hear the wind against the window. She could hear, very faintly, the sound of Gideon's boots in the passage. He had come in from the barn without either of them noticing. She didn't look toward the passage. She kept her eyes on Fen. "Are you threatening this ranch?" she said. Fen smiled. It did not reach his eyes. "I'm describing the landscape, as a courtesy." "I appreciate the courtesy," she said. "I'll relay your description to Mr. Hart and to Ruth Halder. Good afternoon." Fen held her gaze for a moment longer. Then he picked up his hat, and Croft stood, and they went out. She did not move until she heard the wagon moving away down the cleared track. Gideon was in the doorway to the passage. "How long were you there?" she asked. "Long enough," he said. She sat down. She was not going to pretend, not with him, not now, that the visit hadn't rattled her. Her hands were steady on the table. She had good control over her hands. But the steadiness cost something, and they both knew it. "Significant resources and a long history in this county," she said. "What does that mean, specifically?" Gideon came and sat down across from her. He was quiet for a moment, and she recognized this pause as a different kind from his usual consideration. This was the pause of someone deciding how much to say. "Consolidated Range has been operating in this county since before I was born," he said. "They've had disputes with other landowners. Some of those disputes went to court. Some of them didn't." He stopped. "What happened to the ones that didn't go to court?" He looked at her. "The Denny family had a grazing lease east of here. They had a disagreement with Range about water rights in 1949. By 1951, they were gone. The family, the lease, all of it." She sat with that. "What do you mean, gone?" "I mean their operation stopped being viable," he said carefully. "Equipment problems. Supply difficulties. The bank called their financing. These things happen in ranching." "Do they happen on their own, or do they get arranged?" He met her eyes. "I don't know. I've never been able to prove anything. But the Denny timing has always seemed," he paused, "convenient for Range. The weight of this settled differently than the previous consolidated Range problems. The survey dispute was a legal challenge, and legal challenges had a process, a venue, a set of rules. What Gideon was describing was something else. Not a fight you could have in a county courthouse, but a kind of pressure applied through 100 small channels, any one of which could be explained away as bad luck or normal business difficulty. "Our financing," she said immediately. "Who holds the current note on the property?" "First Bank of Crestfall." "And who sits on the board of First Bank of Crestfall?" He was quiet. "Gideon." "I don't know all of them," he said. "I know Fenn's partner, the senior partner at Range, is a man named Hobart. Thomas Hobart. I know he has connections in Crestfall." "Does he have connections at the bank?" "I don't know. Possibly." She stood up. She went to the account ledger and opened it to the financing section, one of the first things she'd fully documented when she restructured the accounts in the summer. The terms of the property note, the payment history, the maturity date. "We're current on payments," she said. "We've always been current." "How current? To the day or to the week?" He looked at her. "To the week, generally." "I want us paying on the exact due date going forward," she said. "Not early, not late. Exact. I don't want to give them any technical basis for anything." She looked up at him. "And I want to know who's on that bank board. I want the names." "How are you going to find that?" "Ruth Halder will know. Or she'll know who to ask." He sat back. He looked at her with something she'd been seeing more frequently in the past weeks. Not quite the recalibration look from their early months, but something that had grown from it, something steadier. Like a man looking at a thing he's decided to trust. "I should have dealt with Range years ago," he said, "when they first came to me about the renegotiation." "What stopped you?" He thought about it honestly, which was one of the things she'd come to rely on in him. He didn't give easy answers to hard questions. "I thought if I didn't engage them, they'd stop," he said. "I thought the agreement was solid enough on its own." "It is solid," she said, "but solid paper doesn't protect itself." She paused. "You were managing this whole operation alone. The sheep, the land, the financing, the supply chains, the weather. You couldn't also be managing a legal strategy." He looked at her. "And now?" She closed the ledger. Now you're not alone. The silence that followed was different from all the silences before it. Not heavy, not loaded with anything unsaid. Just quiet. The way a room is quiet when something that needed to be established has been established, and both people in it know it. She wrote to Ruth Halder the following morning. The letter went out with Walt Tatch, who made supply runs to Crestfall twice a month, even in winter, and had been carrying their correspondence since November with a discretion she appreciated and had not had to ask for. He seemed to understand, with the instinct of someone who had lived alongside this valley's dynamics for decades, that their business was theirs. Ruth's response came back 12 days later. She confirmed that Thomas Hobart did not sit on the First Bank of Crestfall board directly. His brother-in-law did. She had also, at her own initiative, begun a preliminary review of the survey question and had located Harold Pence, now retired but sharp, according to Ruth, who was willing to provide a sworn statement affirming his 1948 methodology if it came to that. Evelyn read the letter twice and then handed it to Gideon across the supper table. He read it. He set it down. She did that on her own? He said. She did. Why? Evelyn thought about it. Because she's a woman who's been practicing law in a county where range has been throwing its weight around for 30 years, she said, and someone finally gave her a case where the documentation is solid. Gideon looked at the letter again. We're going to owe her. We're going to pay her, Evelyn said. Fairly and on time. He almost smiled. She was starting to think of it as his almost smile now, that brief occupation of his face by something lighter than his usual expression. She had begun, she realized, to look for it. Not in any way she'd have been comfortable naming, not yet, but she noticed when it appeared, and she noticed when it didn't. There was a night in late February, the coldest night of the winter, the thermometer on the barn wall reading temperatures she had not known existed outside of geography books, when the stove in the main room needed to be kept at a higher level than usual to maintain any livable heat in the house, and they had both gravitated to the main room without discussing it, because their respective bedrooms were simply too cold for anything other than sleeping. She sat at the table with the projections she was updating for spring. He sat in the chair near the stove with what she'd come to think of as his reading chair, working through a year-old copy of a ranching journal that one of the Tatch brothers had brought out from Crestfall in November. They didn't talk for 2 hours. The stove crackled. The wind moved around the house in long, sustained waves. Outside, the temperature was impossible, and inside they were warm, and neither of them said anything about it. She made tea at some point, and she brought him a cup without asking, because by February she knew how he took it, and he knew she'd bring one without being asked to. He looked up from the journal when she set it beside him. "Thank you," he said. "It's cold enough for tea," she said, which was not exactly what either of them was talking about, and they both knew it. She went back to the projections. He went back to the journal. Later, she would think about this night, not as a turning point, because turning points were things you identified looking back, and in the moment it was just two people sitting near a warm stove in a very cold winter, doing their respective work. But there was something in it, in the ease of it, in the way the silence was neither empty nor fraught, but simply inhabited, that she had not experienced before. Not in Ohio, not in her father's house, not in the apartment above the dry goods store, not anywhere. Two people in a room, each knowing the other was there, and the knowing being enough. She did not write it in the notebook. March announced itself with a storm that was technically the worst of the season, measured by sustained wind speed and total snowfall. It lasted 9 days. By the 4th day, Evelyn had reorganized every supply calculation she'd made in September to account for the extended duration, identified which categories were adequate and which needed conservation adjustments, and presented Gideon with a reduced-use plan for the remaining feed reserves that would carry them through 4 weeks beyond the storm's end, which she calculated was the latest possible date for the passes to reopen. He reviewed the plan. He changed 2 things: the conservation ratio on the protein supplement, which he argued could be reduced further without impacting the pregnant ewes, and the rotation schedule on the barn spaces, which he felt she'd been conservative about in a way that would cost them unnecessary labor. He was right on both counts. She amended the plan. "You changed 2 things," she said. "You left room for it," he said. She had. Not consciously or not fully consciously, but she had. She recognized now, been building in a margin for his expertise, the physical, animal expertise that couldn't be learned from a ledger or a library book. The knowledge that lived in 11 years of watching these specific animals in this specific valley through this specific kind of winter. She had been accounting for what she didn't know. "Good system," he said, in the tone he used when he meant something more than the words. "It works if both people use it honestly," she said. By the 8th day of the storm, they had stopped performing normalcy for each other in the way people do when they're in close quarters and still maintaining some notion of separate selves. She stopped excusing herself from the room when she needed to work through something she found difficult. He stopped leaving the house every time a silence grew past a certain length, which she had noticed him doing in the early months as a kind of pressure relief. They argued twice, once about the lamb rotation, once about a supply decision she'd made without consulting him, that he felt had been within her purview, but that he'd have done differently. And both arguments were honest and relatively short, and resolved into a position that was better than either of their starting ones. She did not know, precisely, when she had stopped thinking of Hart Ridge as the place she had come to and started thinking of it as the place she was from. It wasn't a moment. It was an accumulation, small and daily, like the way snow changes a landscape, not one flake at a time, but gradually, until one morning you look out, and what was there before is underneath something new, and the new thing is simply how it is now. She was outside checking the cleared path to the barn on the morning of the 9th day when the wind stopped. Not reduced. Stopped. Between one breath and the next, the sound that had been constant for 9 days was simply gone, and the silence that replaced it was so absolute it was almost loud. She stood in the path with the shovel in her hand and the cold pressing in from every direction, and she listened to it. Gideon came out behind her. He stood beside her and listened too. The sky to the east had gone from the flat gray of the storm to something that was not quite blue yet, but was considering it. "Is it done?" she asked. "I think so," he said. She exhaled. The breath was visible in the cold, a small cloud that dispersed immediately. The winter, she thought, had done what Nora said it did. It had found out who she was. It had taken every resource she had, the practical ones, the emotional ones, the physical ones she hadn't known she possessed, and applied sustained pressure to them until she either collapsed or became something that didn't collapse. She was still standing. Her knee had a scar on it that would be there for the rest of her life. She had 4 months of accounts that were the most accurate Hart Ridge had ever produced. She had a lamb in the barn who would never have a name, but who was alive because of a rope held on an icy trail at the end of what she had been able to do. She had a legal strategy in motion that Consolidated Range had not anticipated because they had assumed this ranch was still what it had been before June. It was not what it had been before June. Gideon was looking at the sky. She was looking at the valley, the long white sweep of it, the mountains standing in the early light. "Spring list," she said. "Upper fence perimeter, barn east wall reinforcement, cold room exterior ceiling, wool transport renegotiation with the Tatch brothers. Cy is ready for a larger role, and Walt knows it. We should formalize that before someone else does." He was quiet for a moment. "Anything else?" "The water channel on the south pasture needs to be cleared before the snow melt. If we don't do it in the first week, we'll have flooding in the low section." "I know about the water channel." "I know you know," she said. "I'm putting it on the list so it doesn't fall to the 3rd week when everything else is happening." He looked at her. The early light was doing something to the valley that she didn't have words for, something with the snow and the new angle of sun. He looked at her, and she looked at the valley, and he said very quietly, "I'm glad you answered the advertisement." She was not prepared for it, not the words. She had imagined various versions of this conversation, the way you imagine things you don't quite let yourself imagine. But the plainness of it, the complete lack of ceremony. Just that, stated directly, the same way he had told her the truth about brutal winters and constant work in a letter she'd read at a hardware store desk in Ohio a lifetime ago. She looked at him. She said, "I almost didn't." "I know," he said. She turned back to the valley. "I'm glad I did," she said. The sun was coming up properly now, and the snow was starting to catch it. And somewhere in the barn the lamb that had no name was making a noise completely disproportionate to her size. And the valley was quiet, and the winter was done. And both of them stood in the cold morning light with their breath-making small clouds that dispersed immediately into the clean mountain air, and neither of them said anything else. and it was enough. Spring came to Hart Ridge the way it always came to high country. Not gently, not all at once, but in arguments. A warm week followed by 3 days of hard frost, the snow retreating from the south-facing slopes while the north sides held their white for another month. The river swelling with snowmelt until the sound of it was constant, a low rushing presence that Evelyn had not heard since October and had almost forgotten was there. She cleared the South Pasture Water Channel in the first week of March, as planned, with Gideon on the other end of the work and Cy Tatch lending a third pair of hands that made the difference between a one-day job and a two-day one. The flooding in the low section was minimal, a manageable spread that receded in 4 days without reaching the fence line. She noted it in the accounts under spring maintenance, successful intervention, and moved to the next item on the list. The upper fence perimeter took most of March. There was a morning in the middle of that work. She and Gideon on opposite ends of a fence line that ran along a ridge with a view that she still had not made her peace with, meaning she still sometimes stopped and looked at it in a way that cost her a minute or two of productivity, when Douglas Peel rode up from the valley below. He came over the ridge on his gray horse and pulled up a respectful distance from the fence work, and took his hat off, which she had never seen him do. "Evelyn," he said, and it was the first time he had used her name directly. "Douglas," she said. He looked at the fence work, at the posts, which were correctly spaced and properly set, and were going to hold whatever the next winter decided to send. At her, in her work coat and gloves, with the post driver leaning against her hip. "I heard about the range business," he said, "the survey challenge." "Did you?" "Word gets around." He turned his hat in his hands, a slow rotation. "I had my own trouble with them, 7 years ago, water rights on my east boundary." "What happened?" "I backed down," he said. I was on my own, and they had resources, and I backed down." He stopped turning his hat. "I've thought about it since." She looked at him. Douglas Peel was not a man who made admissions easily. She had understood that from their first meeting, when he'd ridden over to inspect her, and had done so with the kind of speculative detachment that men use when they've decided a woman is temporary. He was not looking at her that way now. "The survey challenge isn't going to hold," she said. "Ruth Halder has Harold Pence's sworn statement and the original registration documents. If they file, they'll lose." "I know," he said. "That's partly why I came." He settled his hat back on his head. "If you need a neighboring rancher to provide a statement about the historical boundaries, the way the land has been operated, where the lines have always been understood to fall, I know those hills. I've ridden that boundary for 20 years. She was quiet for a moment. "That would be useful," she said. "I know it would." He gathered his reins. "You should have what you need." He rode back down the ridge without waiting for further response, which she appreciated. The offer had been made cleanly and didn't need ceremony. She watched him go and then turned back to the fence line. Gideon was watching her from the other end of the section. "I heard," he called. "Good," she called back. "Get Ruth Halder's address for me tonight. He'll need to know where to send a statement." He nodded and went back to his post. She went back to hers. Ruth Halder filed the preemptive legal response to Consolidated Ranges Survey Challenge in early April, a comprehensive document that included Harold Pence's sworn statement, Douglas Peel's boundary testimony, Evelyn's fully reconstructed accounting records showing 9 years of operations consistent with the surveyed boundaries, and a secondary argument that Ruth had developed independently regarding the specific legal standing of Consolidated Ranges claim under Colorado property law, which was, according to Ruth's letter accompanying the filing, not as strong as they believed it to be, and substantially weaker than they expected anyone to notice. Evelyn read that line twice and felt something that was close to satisfaction, but cleaner. The response from Consolidated Range came 6 weeks later, delivered by a different lawyer, not Fenn, not anyone they'd seen before, a man from Denver who wrote in the careful, minimizing language of someone who had been given the task of withdrawing a position gracefully. The survey challenge was being set aside. The original agreement would stand. The percentage, 8% through 1968, remained unchanged. She received this letter on a Tuesday morning and read it at the table by the window where she had read every significant document since arriving at Hart Ridge, and then she put it in the legal correspondence file under Consolidated Range, resolved, and went back to the spring lambing accounts she'd been working on. Gideon came in an hour later from the lambing barn. "Letter came," she said, without looking up from the accounts. He picked it up. He read it. He set it back on the corner of the table. She looked up, then. "It's done?" he said. "It's done." He stood there for a moment with his hands in his coat pockets and his expression doing the thing it did when something significant had happened, and he was absorbing it without performing absorption. She had come to find this quality in him genuinely restful. The absence of theater, the willingness to feel something without requiring an audience for it. "Ruth Halder should be compensated well," he said. "I've already calculated it," she said. "It's in the spring accounts. I'd like to add a bonus beyond the agreed fee. It's warranted." "Agreed," he said, without hesitation. "And Douglas Peel." He looked at her. "Douglas doesn't take money from neighbors." "No," she said. "But his east fence line needs 2 new corner posts. I looked at it when he rode up to the ridge last month. I know where we have the material." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "That's a different language." "It's the right one for him?" she said. He almost smiled. It was fully a smile now, she realized. Had been for several weeks, actually, the almost having completed itself somewhere between January and March, without her noticing the exact moment. It was not a large smile. It was the smile of a man who didn't do it often and therefore meant it completely when he did. "You figured that out about him from one conversation on the ridge," he said. "I figured it out from everything," she said. "People tell you who they are. You just have to pay attention." He looked at her for a moment in the way that had become familiar, direct, steady, the full weight of his attention, which was considerable. "You've been paying attention," he said. "Since June," she said. She went back to the accounts. He went back to the lambing barn. Outside, through the window, the valley was so fully in spring now that it barely resembled the place she'd arrived in. The meadows running green, the river down from its snowmelt peak, the sheep spread out across the lower pasture in the particular scattered pattern of animals that have been inside too long and have discovered, with visible enthusiasm, that outside still exists. The lamb, the one with no name who had come into the world furious on a January night after a rope hold on an icy trail, was somewhere in that lower pasture now, indistinguishable from the others, fully a member of the flock, carrying no indication of what it had cost to get her there. Evelyn looked for her sometimes. She could never be certain which one she was. She thought that was probably appropriate. Nora Calloway arrived in April with bread in a manner that had shifted subtly since the previous summer. She still didn't extend warmth easily. That wasn't her nature. But she had stopped watching Evelyn with the assessing eye of someone awaiting an inevitable departure. The departure had not come. The assessment had reached its conclusion. "The range business is settled," Nora said. It was not a question. Word had apparently traveled with its usual efficiency. "It's settled," Evelyn confirmed. Nora set the bread on the table and stood with her hands on her hips, looking at the room. In the months since her first visit, the room had changed. The account system on the table was organized. The shelves held supplies inventoried and labeled. The wall near the stove had a planning board. A piece of flat wood she'd mounted with a season's schedule chalked on it in her small handwriting that had not existed before she arrived, and that Gideon had initially looked at with mild skepticism and now consulted without thinking about it. "The last woman who was in this room," Nora said, "used to cry on Wednesday afternoons." Evelyn looked at her. "Clara?" "She tried to hide it. She wasn't successful." Nora was quiet for a moment. "She was a good person. This place was wrong for her. There's no shame in that." She looked at Evelyn directly. "You don't cry on Wednesday afternoons." "I cry on other occasions," Evelyn said, "when it's warranted." "I imagine you do," Nora said. "You have enough sense for that." This was, Evelyn had come to understand, as close to approval as Nora Calloway gave anyone. She accepted it in the spirit offered. The Tatch brothers came out in May to discuss the wool transport arrangement for the coming year, and the conversation was different from the one they'd had the previous fall. Walt was negotiating with someone he now understood to be a fixed element of Hart Ridge, rather than a temporary one, and his terms reflected that, more specific, more equitable, with a structure that acknowledged the ranch's growing output and the corresponding value it brought to the transport relationship. Evelyn had prepared for the conversation with 3 pages of notes and arrived at the table knowing exactly what she wanted and what she was willing to give on. They reached an agreement in 90 minutes. Cy Tatch, now formalized in the larger role she'd identified for him in March, shook her hand at the end with the solemnity of someone who was taking a professional relationship seriously for the first time and knew it. Fair terms, Walt said, gathering his papers. They're meant to be, she said. Walt looked at Gideon. Gideon looked at Evelyn. Walt looked back at the papers he was folding. Hartridge is running different than it was, Walt said. Not to either of them specifically, just as an observation, a fact being entered into the record. It is, Gideon said. It was a June morning, almost exactly a year from the morning she'd arrived at Crestfall Station with a trunk and 3 overdue library books. When Gideon found her at the east boundary of the property, where she'd gone to check the repaired fence line and had ended up sitting on a flat rock overlooking the valley with her notebook open and nothing written in it, he came and sat beside her, not close, not far, on the same rock, which was wide enough for 2 people if neither of them was taking up unnecessary space. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Thinking," she said. "About what?" She looked at the valley. She had been trying to articulate something to herself for several weeks, and she had not managed it yet in the privacy of her own mind, so she was not certain she could manage it out loud. But he had asked plainly, and she answered plainly, because they had built that between them, and she was not going to undercut it now. "I've been thinking about what I expected," she said, "when I answered the advertisement." "What did you expect?" "I don't know. I was trying not to expect anything." She paused. "I expected hard work. I expected difficulty. I expected to learn things I didn't know." She looked at the notebook. "I didn't expect to feel like myself." He was quiet for a moment. "You feel like yourself here." "More than I ever did in Ohio," she said, "and I lived there for 27 years, so that's—" She stopped. "That's something I'm still working out what to do with." He sat with that. The valley was doing its June thing. The light on it in the morning was a particular quality she had tried to write in the notebook and had failed, because some things genuinely don't reduce to description. The sheep were moving in the lower meadow. The river was audible, not the roar of snowmelt, but the steady, permanent voice of water that has a course it knows. "I've been thinking too," he said. She waited. "I've been thinking that what we have here—" He stopped, tried again. "What we've built, this year. I don't want it to be a business arrangement." She looked at him. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the valley, the same valley he had lived alongside for 11 years. The same view he had absorbed so thoroughly that he usually didn't seem to see it anymore. But he was seeing it now, or something about it, or using it to organize what he was trying to say. "It already isn't," she said quietly. He looked at her then. She held his gaze. She was not a woman who looked away from things, and she was not going to start now, not with this. "I know," he said. "I wanted to say it anyway. I wanted to say it in words instead of just—" He gestured slightly, a small movement that encompassed the fence repair, and the lambing records, and the rope on the icy trail, and the lamp on the right side of the table. "All of that counts," she said. "I know it does," he said. "You count the things that other people miss. That's one of the things—" He stopped again. He was not good at this, and he knew it, and he wasn't pretending otherwise. "That's one of the things I noticed, from the beginning." She looked down at the notebook. She thought about Martha Holloway in the feed store, about the word pathetic said loud enough for 3 people to hear. She thought about Darryl and his condescension, and Mrs. Patterson on the sidewalk, and 10 years of being the most reliable, invisible person in a town that never once asked her what she wanted. She thought about the paid-in-full notice on the wobbling table, and the 4 minutes in January when she had lain in bed and could not find a reason to get up. None of it had been wasted. That was the thing she'd been trying to write in the notebook, and couldn't. Every year of it, every unpaid debt and underpaid hour and overlooked answer, none of it had been waste, because it had made her into someone who could hold a rope on an icy trail and face down a land company lawyer and rebuild 11 years of deficient accounts, and tell a proud man, plainly and without drama, that she had come here with nothing and built something worth keeping. She had not escaped her old life. She had spent it, slowly and with full interest, into this one. "Gideon," she said, "yes." "Ask me." He was quiet for one moment. The valley was quiet. The sheep moved in the distant meadow. "Will you stay?" he said. Not under the arrangement we came in with. Just Will you stay? She had known, for some time, that she would. She had known it before she knew it, in the way that important things settle into certainty before your conscious mind gets around to acknowledging them. She had known it the night of the North Penn Wall, when she'd stood in the dark with her knee bleeding and not called out. She had known it when she'd written full picture received in her notebook and meant more than the accounts. She had known it on the morning the wind stopped after 9 days, and she'd stood in the cleared path and listened to the silence and felt, for the first time in her adult life, something that was not relief at difficulty ending, but the specific, unfamiliar weight of not wanting to be anywhere else. Yes, she said. Not of course. Not I thought you'd never ask. Just yes, clean and direct, the same register they'd used with each other since the first morning at the station when she'd climbed up on the wagon without waiting for a hand. He nodded. Once. And then he did something she had not seen him do before. He reached over and put his hand over hers where it rested on the notebook. Not a dramatic gesture, just his hand over hers, for a moment, on the rock on the east boundary of a property that had been tested from every direction this past year and was still standing. She did not move her hand. They sat like that for a while, looking at the valley. He took his hand back eventually, not abruptly, just naturally, the way you set something down when you've held it long enough. They walked back down to the ranch together. She went to the accounts. He went to the sheep. The summer was the best the ranch had produced in Gideon's 11 years, by every measure she tracked. The wool yield was up 14% over the previous year, a result of better flock management through the winter and an improved nutrition protocol she'd worked out with him in the evenings over the old ranching journals. The supply costs were down 22% from their pre-Evelyn level. The silver percentage came in on schedule, as it would continue to do, and went into the accounts under the line she'd created for it, long-term operational buffer. She did not touch it for anything non-essential. It sat there, steady, like a foundation under the foundation. Nora came in July and did not ask how long Evelyn planned to stay. They drank tea. They talked about the lambing rates and the coming wool prices, and whether the summer was running drier than usual, which Nora thought it was, and Evelyn reserved judgment pending more data. Nora left the bread and took her wagon back down through the valley without further ceremony, and Evelyn watched her go from the doorway and felt the particular quiet satisfaction of a relationship that had found its level. Douglas Peel sent a note in August. The corner post for his east fence had been installed. He didn't mention who had provided the materials. He asked if he might speak with Evelyn about his own accounting system, which he described as inadequate, which she suspected was an understatement. She wrote back that she'd come over in September when the immediate post-summer work had settled. She went in September. His accounting system was not inadequate. It was genuinely alarming. She spent 3 hours there and left him with a framework and a list of priorities and the name of Ruth Halder's office, because 2 of the issues she'd found had potential legal dimensions. On the ride back to Hart Ridge, alone on the trail she'd been riding for over a year now, and knew as well as she'd known the streets of Shelby, she thought about how strange it was that competence, once it existed somewhere, tended to spread. You fix one thing and it touches the next thing and the next, not because you planned it that way, but because that's how broken systems work. They touch each other, and so do the solutions. She had not set out to help Douglas Peel or Ruth Halder or Cy Tatch or anyone else in this valley. She had set out to make her own situation viable, to do her job well enough that the arrangement held, and the winter didn't break her, and the land company didn't take what wasn't theirs. But here she was, a year later, riding back through a mountain valley in September light, with mud on her boots and a list of Douglas Peel's accounting priorities in her coat pocket. Wanting to help yourself and ending up helping others, she thought, was not a contradiction. It was just what happened when you did something properly. She wrote that in the notebook that night. Not the poetic version, just the plain one. Competence spreads. This is worth remembering. On a morning in late September, the aspens had gone gold, which was something the books had mentioned and reality had substantially exceeded. Evelyn was updating the annual accounts when she found the page she'd written on her first full day at the table by the window. August of the previous year. The initial reconstruction of the ledger she'd found in the back of the drawer. And at the bottom, in her small handwriting, full picture received. Accounting complete as of August 14. She read it. She thought about who had written it, a woman who had been at Hart Ridge for 6 weeks, who was still measuring every word and every step, who had found a hidden ledger and handled it carefully because she was operating in a situation she didn't yet fully understand and couldn't afford to misread. She understood it now. A year of understanding it accumulated daily, the way all real understanding accumulates. Not in revelations, but in the slow, patient work of paying attention to something long enough that it stops being strange. She turned to a fresh page. She wrote the date. She began the second year's accounts. The numbers were better, significantly better, and not by accident. Every improvement had a traceable cause: the restructured supply ordering, the accurate flock count, the improved lambing protocol, the legal defense of the silver percentage, the wool transport renegotiation, the winter preparations that had cost them 2 sheep instead of the potential 30 or 40 that a bad winter without preparation could take. You could follow the line from every decision to its outcome in the accounts, and the accounts didn't lie. And what they said was that Hart Ridge had not just survived the year, it had changed shape into something more durable. She was part of that shape now, not a correction to something broken, a structural element. She did not write that in the notebook either. Some things you know without needing to record them. Gideon came in at noon and stood at her shoulder for a moment, looking at the page she was on. "Better," he said. "Significantly," she said. "Because of the winter prep?" "Because of everything," she said. "The winter prep, the legal business, the transport renegotiation, the lambing improvements. It compounds. Each thing that works makes the next thing slightly more possible." He was quiet for a moment, reading the numbers. She let him read. She had learned that he absorbed figures slowly but retained them completely. "What does next year look like?" he said. She turned to the projection page she'd already begun. "Better," she said. "If we follow the spring priority list and the lambing protocol holds and range doesn't come back." "They won't come back," he said. There was a certainty in it, she believed. "Then the projection is strong, not comfortable. I don't think this valley does comfortable, but strong." "No," he said, "it doesn't do comfortable." She looked up at him. He was looking at the page, but his expression had the quality she'd come to know, present, attending to more than the immediate surface of things. "I don't want comfortable," she said. He looked at her then. "I know," he said. "That's why it works." It was not a declaration. It was not the kind of thing that would be written in a letter or said in front of other people. It was just a fact, identified and stated in the plain language they had built between them over a year of shared work and shared difficulty, and 2 people learning to trust not just each other's judgment, but each other's character. She turned back to the accounts. He went back to the sheep. Outside, the valley was doing what it did. The light in September different from June, more golden, more definite, the mountains in it seeming both closer and more permanent. The flock was in the upper pasture, the repaired fence holding, the season running toward its end. In a few weeks, the first frost would come, and the preparations would begin again, and the winter would test them again, and they would be ready. And some things would go wrong that they hadn't anticipated, and they would handle those too. She had come here not knowing what she was looking for, only knowing she couldn't stay where she was. She had found, not what she'd imagined, because she deliberately refused to imagine anything, but something better than imagination, something with the specific weight and texture of actual life. It was difficult. It was frequently unglamorous. It involved mud and cold and arguments and a lamp on the right side of a table for reasons she had eventually stopped questioning. It was hers, not by accident, not by fortune, by the same accumulation that built everything worth having, decision by decision, day by day, the choice to stay made not once but repeatedly, in every small moment where leaving would have been easier. She closed the accounts. She stood and stretched and looked out the window at the valley she had not chosen because it was easy or safe or familiar, but because something in a newspaper advertisement had spoken to a woman who had been invisible for 10 years and told her the truth, and the truth had been enough. The mountains did not care who she was or where she'd come from. They didn't offer comfort or approval. They only offered what they'd always offered the people who stayed long enough to understand the terms, a place to prove what you were made of, and the evidence, permanent and unambiguous, of having done it. She went outside. The air was cold and clear and full of the smell of autumn at altitude, something she had never smelled before June of last year, something she now understood was one of the particular signatures of this place, this valley, this exact altitude and aspect and arrangement of mountains that existed nowhere else in the world quite as it did here. She breathed it in. Somewhere across the meadow, she could hear Gideon's whistle, 2 short notes, 1 long, and the dog's movement, and the sound of the flock adjusting to it, and the river, and the wind coming down from the peaks, and all of it together was the sound of a life that had been built from something that looked, from a feed store in Ohio, like a desperate gamble, and felt, standing here now in September light, like the most rational decision she had ever made. She did not think about Shelby. She did not think about Martha Holloway or Daryl or the wobbling kitchen table. She picked up the fence tool she'd left by the door that morning and walked out toward the east boundary, and the valley held everything she needed, and she went to work.